Father Eamonn Conway is a priest of the Archdiocese of Tuam in the west of Ireland. And then 22 years ago, he took up a post in Mary Immaculate College in Limerick, which is Ireland's only Catholic teacher training college. And he is currently Professor of Theology and Religious Studies in Mary I. In 1984, the young Eamonn Conway, still a seminarian in Maynooth, went to work on Lough Derg as cantor to lead the singing. As I said, after ordination, he went to Germany for further studies, but since his return to Ireland, he has worked as priest in Lough Derg for part of almost every season since the early 90s. So Eamonn, like Father Lough, has a unique insight, I think, into Lough Derg through two sets of lenses. The lens of the priest ministering to the pilgrim, but also through the lens of being a pilgrim himself. And I think it was this dual aspect of insight, together with his deep personal love for Lough Derg, that led Eamonn to write his book a number of years ago, Island of Quiet Miracles. He talks of Lough Derg being a place that has the power to transform our lives. He has a deep love for it, which comes across very clearly in his book, and certainly the whole thing of making Lough Derg relevant in today's world. And I'm sure he will delve more deeply into both of those aspects in his talk. And so I will hand you over now to Father Eamonn.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for the kind invitation to give this lecture. And Mary, thank you very much for that lovely and warm introduction. Yeah, my memories of Lough Derg, and I presume I've met many of you on the island over the years, go really back to those early 80s. If I can just very quickly tell one memory from my very first season working there that involves Father Flynn. I was cantor, as Mary explained, and if you remember, we had the old pulpit. Do you remember the old pulpit, the circular pulpit that was there in the just in the before the sanctuary in the church? And that's where the cantor used to lead the singing from. And one of the jobs of the cantor, that time, of course, we had these massive numbers, and we'd hear confessions all the way around the basilica. So we used to have to carry these kneelers in and out so that people could recognize where the confession stations were, and people could kneel for confession. And we've been doing this for weeks, really, and my back at this stage was giving up. And I remember getting very sharp back pain as I was doing it that morning, then going out to lead the opening hymn for the service of reconciliation, and starting off with, "Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart," and promptly collapsing. And Father Flynn stepping over me, at least this is my memory, going, "Be all else but not to me." Anyway, that's my memory of it. Father Flynn may have a different one, but the show had to go on. The pilgrims came first, you know, and I was later carted off to hospital, but that's okay. I mean, that's all fine. That's all part of it. Lough Derg is a very, very special place and a very precious place to me, and I've made lifelong friends through the gift of being able to work there. And so I'm delighted to have this opportunity just to share with you some thoughts on the 3-day pilgrimage. And let me say straight away, these are my thoughts. When you come and you do your pilgrimage, you're on sacred ground, you're engaging in a relationship, you're deepening a relationship with your Creator, which nobody else's interpretation of that moment can displace. You know, so you have your own sacred moments. You know, maybe you have your own precious place on Lough Derg that's sacred to you. I'm going to share with you mine so that it may help you to reflect on your own, but I certainly don't want you to simply take on mine or see mine in any way as definitive. And of course, if you haven't yet been to Lough Derg, and there may be some here who haven't, then there's an excellent book on sale in the bookshop that tells you all about the pilgrimage. You know, I'm sure that the Mary will stay online afterwards to take names and addresses and give you the count number. No, anyway, okay, so let's get moving. So I'm going to share with you a few slides just so you don't have to look at me the whole time. So just give me a moment here to see if this works. I'm going to share the screen with you. So you should be seeing some slides there now, and I'll just move them on to the first slide, which gives you the structure of the program. Just let me see if that's if that's actually working. Yeah, there we go. So this is the structure of what I intend to present to you. So I am talking about the 3-day pilgrimage in the context of the global pandemic, the global crisis we've been going through. So I want to talk a little bit about the impact of COVID-19. And then I want to talk a little bit about what Pope Francis has been calling us to attend to at this time. And then we'll talk a little bit about the 3-day pilgrimage as what I'm going to call a spiritual vaccination. And finally, Lough Derg as a wellspring of well-being. And I've chosen that word well-being quite deliberately, and you'll be familiar with that, that was in the blurb, I think, for our talk. So that's the structure of what I want to do with you. So let's talk a little bit about COVID-19 and the brevity of life. Again, you have your own experience of this past year now, more than a year that we've all been going through. For me, it has been a time of great vulnerability. My dad, as many people know, he's 94, he lives with me, and I took on his care about 2.5 years ago now. And so when this pandemic struck, of course, it left us very isolated in the care for him in terms of the backup of hospital care, of people coming in to assist in his care and so on. And so I had to really cocoon in the house with him, and try at the same time to do my work here, work in the college, lecturing and so on from home. And overall, it has worked out very, very well. But it has been a profound sense of loss of autonomy, I would say, loss of being in control. And I think that has been the experience for many, many people at this time. Maybe a sense of shared helplessness. And we've seen many images of this as we watched loved ones looking at their loved ones through windows in nursing homes, for example. That'll be an image that will stay with me from this time. People have had to remain outside the churches while the funeral of loved ones took place. People not being able to be with their loved ones in their last moments, or at times indeed of illness or grief. People not being able to access the medical care they needed, and just maybe a general sense of isolation. I think a lot of people maybe for the first time found that the struggle to actually allow themselves to be dependent on others, and of course to find that the crisis drew great generosity and selflessness and service out of so many people who offer themselves in so many maybe small but significant and important ways, apart from, of course, the selflessness of those who were on the front line in so many different ways. But I think it has been an experience to some extent of not being in control. I mean, particularly here in the West, we're so used, I mean, by the West meaning the Western world, we're so used to being able to click our fingers and things happen. And this has now been a case of a shared sense of vulnerability as a society. And I think our ability to cope with that will be to some extent dependent on the other experiences we've had in our lives of being dependent, how comfortable we are with being dependent or interdependent upon one another, on being, as John Moriarty, the mystic storyteller, used to say, about being generous receivers. He used to say that we Irish were mean receivers. We could be generous at giving, but we didn't like the humility that was required to be receivers. And I suppose, to some extent, the realization that we are dependent upon others, that we're not independent, autonomous as much as we like, that autonomy really, when it comes down to it, to use a phrase of the late Michael Paul Gallagher, is an illusion, has been a bit of a shock to our systems. I think maybe particularly for young people, of course, it's part and parcel of the joy of being young, is that you think you're absolutely autonomous, that you're indestructible in some respects. And to have found their freedoms curtailed in so many ways has been a deep shock to them. So I think we will have coped to some extent with the crisis of the last year, to the extent that we are comfortable with vulnerability, if everyone can become comfortable with it, but at least not entirely fazed by it, that we've built up a certain resilience by having to deal with a sense of dependency in the past, of trusting other people in the past, and that maybe we've come through deep enough struggles in our own lives. The second last time I did the pilgrimage back in 2018 was just 10 days before I was admitted to hospital for a planned surgery for prostate cancer. And that pilgrimage perhaps has been one of the best pilgrimages I've done in recent years, because I was resigned to what needed to be done, but of course, naturally, I was scared. And through the grace of God and the accompaniment of good friends, I did that pilgrimage, and it was one of the very best, really. And the moment that stayed with me, that really struck me, was at the end of each station, going into the basilica and praying the Psalm 15. Preserve me, God, I take refuge in you. I say to the Lord, you are my God, my happiness lies in you alone. And then later on in the psalm, even my body shall rest in safety. And for the first time, that line really, really struck me. And I let myself be drawn into trusting that my body would rest in safety, and that the Lord would give me the body, in other words, the health of body and mind that I needed to do God's will. This ties in a bit with the prayer that Mary read for us there from John Henry Newman, that somehow this moment in my life could serve God's purpose. And it was really I experienced healing. I had a few days then for a holiday before going into hospital, and they were among my healthiest in some respects. And I had a deep sense of healing, physical healing actually, during that pilgrimage, not just spiritual or psychological, which I also had, but also a sense of physical healing. So I think that, to me at least, that testifies to the power of what Lough Derg can give to each one of us. But I think also what Lough Derg does is it makes us face reality. And the reality is that we are not in control, that our lives are utterly dependent. We are interdependent creatures, and we don't like being reminded of our creatureliness. And early on in the pandemic, somebody pointed me in the direction of an article, a homily actually given by C.S. Lewis. That name may mean something to some of you, a very famous Christian thinker of the last century, who fought in the First World War and was drawn upon, if you like, to help make sense to some extent of the Second World War. And at the outbreak of the Second World War, he was invited to Oxford to give a lecture, to give a homily at a service to students who were saying maybe we should abandon our scholarship and go off and fight in the war. But he was defending, of course, them doing their studies and the importance of serving God in that particular way. But the lecture, if I can just share with you a few paragraphs from it, he says, the war creates no absolutely new situation. It simply aggravates the permanent human situation so that we can no longer ignore it. Human life has always been lived on the edge of a precipice. And I think what the pandemic has done for us is it has brought home that stark reality to us, here in the West in particular. I mean, if you have traveled, and Mary mentioned some of the places I've had the privilege of being, you'll find people whose daily life is lived on a precipice, who go out to beg, say, at the markets in downtown Kolkata, never know will they ever get back home to their slum, who run risks every day to do ordinary everyday things like maybe get water or to get food for their families and so on. They know that life is lived on a precipice. And if I can say as an aside, some of the happiest people I've ever met in my life have been people who know that life is lived on the edge of a precipice. And I think when we come to Lough Derg, we learn to accept that. We learn to be grateful for the little things in our lives, the little moments of support, of affirmation, of encouragement. We get in touch with those things again. I often say that when I do the 3-day pilgrimage, I find that my senses all are kind of renewed. My sense of taste or smell or touch, all of these senses are kind of replenished or refreshed. I get grounded again. Literally, I get grounded again. But part of it is also that I become a little bit more comfortable with knowing that my life has been lived on the edge of a precipice. Back in 2008, I also had a brush with cancer. I had cancer in my eye. I had eye cancer. And it was a particularly dangerous form of cancer. And the prognosis wasn't great, actually. Thank God it hasn't been realized. Please God, that'll continue to be the way. But the surgeon didn't mince his words. And he said, from now on, your life is going to be like that of those firefighters who every day they have to scale these high ladders to extinguish fires, and they know the risk they're running. But you will get used to the risk. You will get used to the risk, and you'll take it in your stride. And again, that realization that life is lived on the edge of a precipice. So I think that's one of the gifts actually of this time, if we take it seriously and we're not trying to run away from it, and we're not trying to console ourselves with the very many ways we can. I mean, I'm as guilty as anybody else of enjoying the online shopping and the various ways we've compensated to try to maintain our ordinary lives, but realizing that there is a superficiality to the ordinariness of our lives. And I think we'll go to Lough Derg, or in this case now our Lough Derg has been maybe facing COVID head on and realizing that our lives are lived on the edge of a precipice. Here's another paragraph from the same article by C.S. Lewis. And this was to say, was at the outbreak of World War II. What does war do to death? It certainly does not make it more frequent. 100% of us will die. And the percentage cannot be increased. It put several deaths earlier, but I hardly suppose that is what we fear. Maybe it is, of course. Yet war does do something to death. It forces us to remember it. The only reason why the cancer at 60 or the paralysis at 75 do not bother us is that we forget them. War makes death real to us. And that would have been regarded as one of its blessings by most of the great Christians of the past. Just stay with that for a moment. What does war do to death? Doesn't make it more frequent. It forces us to remember it. And that would have been something our ancestors would have welcomed. Might remember, I've heard a phrase, the memento mores. Exactly what we do at the beginning of Lent. Dust you are, and unto dust you shall return. The Psalms, of course, make me know the shortness of my life that I may gain wisdom of heart. I had it up there on a slide a moment ago. That's something about remembering our mortality, remembering our creatureliness, can actually bring us into the depth of what life is about. And we don't need to be scared about it. And again, what I suggest to you is that Lough Derg helps us not to be scared about it. I'll come back to that in a few moments. If I can just go through that paragraph again with you, but I've changed it now. What does COVID-19 do to death? It certainly does not make it more frequent. 100% of us will die. Percentage cannot be increased. It puts several deaths earlier, but I hardly suppose that is what we fear. Yet COVID-19 does do something to death. It forces us to remember it. The only reason why the cancer at 60 or the paralysis at 75 do not bother us is that we forget them. COVID-19 makes death real to us, and that would have been regarded as one of its blessings by Christians of the past. So again, teach us to count our days that we may gain a wise heart. I'm suggesting that Lough Derg, when you do that pilgrimage, it makes us comfortable with reality. Some people, your friends might say to you, God, you're going to Lough Derg to get away from reality. No, you're not. You're going to Lough Derg so you can be comfortable with what is real, with the reality of what we live and face in our day-to-day lives. We go, that's the difference between a retreat and a holiday. Very often a holiday can be an escape from reality, but we have to go back to reality. A genuine retreat never lifts us out of our daily lives, but rather gives us a new way and a new energy and a new focus in living our daily lives. Okay, what has Pope Francis said to us that is helpful perhaps in the last while? Well, you may recall this iconic moment. It'll be one of the lasting memories of our era. Pope Francis addressing an empty St. Peter's Square, striking a very lonely, very solemn, but also a very, very strong figure. And It was March the 27th, so almost a year ago to the day, actually. And he said, among other things, and it's well worth reading that full text, which is available, "This is a time to choose what matters and what passes away, a time to separate what is necessary from what is not. It is a time to get our lives back on track with regard to you, Lord, and to others." That's what Pope Francis saw as the gift of this pandemic. I know it's a strange language to speak, the gift of this pandemic. Could I suggest to you that's a wonderful, wonderful description of the 3-day pilgrimage? An opportunity to choose what matters from what passes away, what is necessary from what is not. Time to get our lives back on track with regard to you, Lord, and to others. I think what we've learned in the last year, if we learn, and of course we can be stubborn, is that sickness and death relativize everything except love. But the only thing that really matters is love. And our attempts to love others and our willingness to accept being loved, which is not always easy either. Death relativizes everything except love. And love in that the various ways it has shown itself in selflessness and self-sacrifice over the past while. So I'm going to move on to my third point now. Won't be keeping you an awful lot longer. Let's talk a little bit specifically about the 3-day pilgrimage. And so I'm calling it here, and I'm not sure how long this description will last, but I'm referring to it here as a spiritual vaccination. Okay, so we're all worked up about the vaccination at the moment. We're wondering when we may get it. Many of you listening may already have got it. I haven't yet. My dad has had the first round of it, and he's scheduled for the second. But I think actually Lough Derg can be a vaccination in the very best sense, not to insulate us, because this vaccine apparently doesn't insulate us. You may still get the disease, but it's not going to kill you. That's the promise. It's not the chance of you not ending up in hospital are less, and the chance of it killing you have been seriously reduced if you're vaccinated. Could I suggest that Lough Derg and doing the pilgrimage can also, in that sense, enable us to be strong when we encounter the challenges and indeed the suffering that is inevitable in every human life. God does not take away our suffering, but God accompanies us in that suffering. God promises us that our sufferings will not conquer us, that our sufferings will not be the last word in our lives. And I suggest to you that that's what the 3-day pilgrimage can do, that it can build up, others will have heard me use this phrase before, just like a good workout builds up your physical muscle, the pilgrimage builds up your spiritual muscle. It gives us an opportunity, and this is a very ancient description of what Lough Derg is about, to face our demons, whatever those demons may be, to face our fears, again accompanied by the Lord, accompanied by the one who did not deny us anything in love, who humbled himself to become one of us and even took on the reality of sin and the reality of death itself. So I believe Lough Derg is a God-given, graced way of entering into what terrifies us, to, if you like, inoculate us from that having control in our lives. It's not that we won't experience terror, or that we won't experience fear, or we won't experience suffering, but we in experiencing it, we need not be burdened down by that, or broken down by that, or defeated by it. Again, the Psalm, I think, comes to life for us in that. You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day, or the pestilence, the plague, the pandemic that stalks in the darkness, or the destruction that lays waste at noon. No, we might fear it. It's okay to fear it. But it's also, as we experience the fear of it or the terror of it, we also experience that it will not have the last word in our lives. So I think is one of the great gifts of Lough Derg for ourselves. And so you may be thinking, how does all this happen? But I think in the emptying of self that goes on, this is what can be flooded into our lives. The emptying of ourselves through the various pilgrim actions, the bare feet, the cold, the hunger, the sleeplessness. We're letting go of our ego. We're letting go of all that blocks us from this accompaniment that the Lord invites us into. And yes, we face the terrors of the night. Nighttime can be a very frightening time for people, for us. But we do not fear the terror of the night. And we rehearse this, we build up our muscle, we vaccinate ourselves for the moments in our daily lives where this can happen. And so finally, Lough Derg is a wellspring of well-being. And this is a photograph of a group, I think, from Cork, I think. Is that right? That did the pilgrimage a couple of years ago. And they are all happy pilgrims. Now, I think they may just got their shoes back on. And I think we all know that moment that is captured in that photograph if we've done the 3-day pilgrimage. And I think that they convey a sense of well-being at the end of the pilgrimage. And it's a moment we all know in our daily lives. Well-being has become one of the catchphrases of our age. And if you have grandchildren or children in school, they are now being bombarded with classes on various kinds of well-being. But I regret to tell you, and I say this as a Catholic educator, you will come across very little insight into spiritual well-being in those classes. And in fact, the sad reality is that classes in religious studies or religious education are being squeezed out to make way for these, if you like, secular concepts of well-being. And that worries me and that disappoints me. And I think it's such a sad reality. And this is the key point I want to make, and I'm going to stop then. A lot of these programs of well-being, there are many of them that are very good, but what they're aimed at is giving you tactics and methods to be strong in yourself. And there's nothing wrong necessarily being strong in yourself. But if you agree with what I've been saying earlier on, it's actually okay and inevitable, in fact, and unavoidable at times to be weak in oneself. And what I think Christian understanding of well-being is that it allows us to face the reality that there are times when I will not be strong in myself, when I will be weak in myself, and that I will need to depend upon others. But a lot of these programs of well-being in our schools now are building people up to is self-reliance, independence. Again, this illusion of autonomy lies underneath them. And that worries me because it is an illusion. They're not actually building, in many instances, people up, certainly not to hope and pray and believe that there is a Lord, that there is a God who loves every single fiber of our being, who is utterly reliable. And that, in fact, genuine well-being comes from surrendering to the mystery of that God in our lives, rather than trying to be independent of that God. So genuine well-being, I think, is built upon what I Christian hope, the hope, which is this conviction. Hope isn't just something about what might happen in the future. It is coming out of the conviction that God has already rescued us, that God has already redeemed us, that God has already died for us. And this is what we will celebrate now very shortly at Easter, that God has already made a life that is not lived in the shadow of death possible for us, that does not lived in the fear of suffering or death possible for us. And so that we find in ourselves the courage to live that life, but not by trying to be autonomous and strong in ourselves, but in fact, in finding in ourselves the courage to let go into the mystery of God, to surrender into the mystery of God. And I suggest to you again that that's what we rehearse, that's what we practice on Lough Derg, is that surrender into the mystery of God. That Lough Derg makes that possible for us as well. A lovely definition of hope. It says, hope becomes a passion for the possible because it can be a passion for what has been made possible. becomes a passion for what God has made possible for us. God has made possible for each one of us a life lived knowing that we are beings unto death, that we will all die, 100% of us will die, and hopefully not earlier rather than later, that we will live good lives and full lives and healthy and happy lives, but that suffering is a part of our lives. Suffering is a reality we all face in various forms, be it spiritual suffering, be it physical suffering, be it mental anguish. But none of these things threaten our very existence because we're held in the love and in the mystery and the grace of God. So that's, I think, part of what we can take away with us from a 3-day pilgrimage. It is genuinely a wellspring, the deepest one I know in our country, really, a wellspring of well-being. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eamon. Absolutely excellent. Yeah, there's just so much there, and I know there's also so much more you could say. I love the metaphor of the spiritual vaccination, because certainly for myself, that's the way I always feel. My own experience of the pilgrimage, that it gives me the courage or the strength or whatever to cope with all that life will throw at me in the year that's coming. And that wellspring of well-being, and all, it tickles me, you know, we go to the pier when people are going home, and you know, they've been deprived of food, they've been deprived of sleep, they've been frozen for 3 days, and yet they're all smiling, you know. So yeah, you've just really captured it all there. So thank you very much again for that.